What would happen if a boss secretly returned to his own restaurant and discovered it had rotted from the inside out to the point it could destroy his family's entire legacy? Adrian Cole stood silently in front of the fogged glass door of Cole's Porterhouse, the place that had once been the pride of his entire family. The evening rain fell in light drizzles, street lights casting their yellow glow across the weathered wooden sign hanging loosely above the entrance. The words, "Since 1987, had faded, and a long scratch cut right through the 7, the same scratch his father, Benjamin Cole, had accidentally made the day he first hung that sign. Adrian reached up, brushing his fingertips over it, feeling the damp, rough surface. A raindrop slid perfectly along the scratch, catching the glow of the light, shining like a tear falling silently onto a memory. He drew a deep breath, pulled the brim of his worn-out baseball cap lower, and tightened the grip on his faded gray jacket, the disguise of an ordinary dishwasher, a far cry from the man who once owned one of the most renowned fine dining steakhouse chains in the region. It had been 3 years since he last set foot here, 3 years lost in spreadsheets and meetings, buried in soulless numbers, 3 years away from the kitchen that had once been the heart of his family. But it was those same cold numbers, alongside carefully handled complaints and management reports, that brought him back tonight. As he pushed open the door, the smell of burnt oil and lingering stale smoke rushed to greet him, shattering every warm memory he had of this place. Adrian stepped forward slowly, as though every step carried the weight of a stone carved from the past. There was a time when, at this very hour, the air would be thick with the rich scent of butter melting on cast-iron pans, blending with the savory aroma of seared steaks, laughter spilling from tables, and the rhythmic clinking of knives and forks, creating a melody of life and warmth. Now, he heard only the sparse clatter of utensils, the faint murmur of 2 customers sitting by the window, and a heavy silence blanketing the room. The once polished tile floor felt greasy underfoot, slippery and neglected. His eyes moved to the meat display case. Ribeye cuts that had once been hand-selected with care now looked grayish, the marbled fat dull and lifeless, tossed on trays with no thought or respect. He lowered his gaze, stifling a sigh, each sight cutting into him like a blade straight to the heart of a man who had once loved every detail of this place. His eyes instinctively searched for something familiar and stopped at the wooden wallboard that used to hold framed photos of smiling customers, handwritten notes from chefs congratulating couples on anniversaries. Now it was empty, covered in a thin film of dust, untouched for months. Adrian swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat, as his father's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, food isn't just about feeding people, it's about making them happy. Every detail, every piece of steak, every handshake should make them feel valued." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, staring into the cold, lifeless space. He tugged his cap lower and moved toward the kitchen. A few employees glanced at him briefly before looking away, not even bothering to greet or ask who he was. The indifference was written in every gesture. Adrian deliberately walked slowly, taking in every detail. A young staff member dropped off a plate of food without fixing the presentation, and when an elderly customer coughed quietly, no one even turned their head to check on him. Passing the kitchen counter, Adrian saw a pan of oil boiling over with no one attending to it, black smoke curling thickly beneath a filthy vent hood. The acrid smell burned in his throat. In his mind, memories of nights spent beside his father came flooding back. He could still see Benjamin Cole standing next to him, those large, calloused hands resting on his son's shoulder, pointing to a perfectly marbled ruby-red steak. "You see this, son? Meat remembers how you treat it. A dull knife, careless hands, and it'll pay you back with bitterness. Only someone who truly cares can make it tender and sweet." Back then, Adrian had eagerly repeated every slicing technique under the bright kitchen lights, smiling as his father beamed beside him. But now, standing in that same kitchen, all he saw were dull knives strewn across cracked wooden cutting boards, steaks left soaking in watery trays, abandoned and flavorless. No one cared anymore. He inhaled deeply, fighting down the anger rising in his chest. Muscles tightened in his forearms as he restrained the urge to slam his fist on the counter. Cole's Porterhouse, the legacy his father had built with passion and integrity, was becoming an empty shell. And he, the man who had traded the heart of the business for corporate reports, was responsible for letting this happen. But not for much longer. Adrian clenched his fists in his pockets and strode toward the dishwashing station. It was time to start from the lowest rung, to watch every corner of this decaying place, and then he would take it all back. The sound of the sink echoed steadily, blending with the clattering of greasy pans being slammed onto the steel counter. Adrian stood in the corner of the kitchen, his hands submerged in murky dishwater, but his eyes were fixed on the main counter, where a man in his 40s, with an air of arrogance, leaned lazily against the wooden rack. That was Dean Holloway, the head chef, and according to reports Adrian had read, supposedly the soul of this branch. But the way Dean smirked as he watched the staff told Adrian everything. This so-called soul was rotting the entire place from within. Dean wasn't holding a knife, nor did he touch any dish. He just stood there, idly twirling an unlit cigarette between his fingers, barking out orders like heavy rivets dropping onto steel. Cut that tenderloin smaller. Customers won't notice. Don't waste the new meat, push the old stock first, got it? His tone was cold, like someone calculating warehouse inventory, not preparing meals for real people. Adrian's grip on the dish towel tightened until his knuckles turned white. Dean's words rang clear across the kitchen, without a shred of shame or hesitation. A young cook hesitated, eyeing the dark red piece of beef with its grayish fat ring sitting on the steel tray. But one sharp look from Dean made the boy lower his head and obey silently. Dean smirked, satisfied with his power, and leaned closer to the man beside him, his voice low but still loud enough for Adrian to catch. Cheap customers don't deserve the good stuff. Cook this well done, and no one will know the difference. Moments later, the sound of clinking silverware came from the dining area. Adrian turned slightly and saw an old man sitting in the corner, clutching his stomach, his face contorted in discomfort. He tried to take another small bite but quickly set down his fork, his face pale. Dean glanced at the table, sneered and mocked. Guess he can't handle our premium Porterhouse steak. He let out a short, dry laugh full of ridicule. The other staff stayed silent, none daring to react except for Clara Reed, a young waitress standing at the counter, who frowned at Dean before bowing her head and continuing to wipe the counter in silence. Adrian had noticed Clara the moment he stepped in. She was the only one who had acknowledged him with a slight nod, even without a smile. Her face looked tired, but the way she polished a glass with a clean cloth and checked each plate before serving revealed a rare respect for the craft. Her quiet diligence stood in stark contrast to the others, making Adrian's chest feel heavier. He lowered his head, still scrubbing the dirty tray, but his eyes stayed locked on Dean. This man was nothing like the chefs his father used to hire, those who were strict but fair and devoted to their work. Dean acted more like a gang leader, ruling through fear and fake toughness. Adrian saw him place a hand on the young cook's shoulder, not a friendly pat, but a firm squeeze that made the boy wince and then hissed, "Just do what I say. You don't want to lose this job, do you?" It was more of a threat than an order. Adrian slipped his wet hand into his coat pocket, his eyes flashing coldly. He didn't react, not yet. It wasn't time. But every word Dean spat out, every careless gesture, cut into Adrian like the blade of a knife. He knew now, without doubt, that this man was the root of the rot-killing Porterhouse from the inside. And silently, Adrian promised himself, Dean's arrogance would soon come back to haunt him. The soft clink of a metal fork against the table rang sharply in the suffocating silence. In the corner sat an elderly man, Walter Briggs, struggling to lift his fork once more, one trembling hand clutching his stomach. His face was ashen, the deep wrinkles on his skin carved even deeper under the harsh yellow glow from the overhead lights. Adrian stopped washing, his eyes locked on the scene. For a brief second, an image of his father, Benjamin Cole, flashed in his mind. His father had once said, "No meal is worth serving if it causes someone pain." Yet here, in this restaurant that was once a symbol of integrity, a man was suffering over a carelessly prepared steak. Clara Reed noticed Walter first. She rushed over, leaning down with concern written all over her face. "Sir, are you all right? Let me get you something else," she offered, her words like a faint spark of light in a dark room. But Dean Holloway's voice sliced through the moment, cold and commanding. "No need for that, Clara. House policy doesn't allow replacements after 15 minutes. Leave it." Clara turned to him, eyes wide in disbelief. "But he's not well, Dean. Clearly there's something wrong with the meat. Dean cut her off, his smirk as sharp as a blade. "That's not our problem. The customer chose the dish. If he can't handle it, that's on him, not the kitchen." He even added mockingly, loud enough for the entire kitchen to hear, "Old folks, weak stomachs. It's not the steak that's bad." A few younger staff let out nervous chuckles, more out of fear than agreement. Clara froze, her lips pressed tightly together, her fingers gripping the edge of the tablecloth until her knuckles turned white. She lowered her head and apologized softly. I'm truly sorry, sir." But Dean stepped forward, blocking her path to Walter. He didn't even glance at the old man, only tilted his head toward Clara, his voice lowered but still audible to Adrian across the kitchen. "You're wasting time. Unless you want your name on the shift cut list, get back to work." Walter slowly stood, trying to preserve what little dignity he had left. He set his fork down, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and gave a faint nod, though his eyes held a quiet sorrow. Clara stood motionless, her hands hanging at her sides, her gaze fixed on the floor. In that moment, every sound around Adrian seemed to fade, leaving only the heavy thud of his own heartbeat. He felt his control slipping. His hands clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms, sending sharp jolts of pain through his skin. In his mind, his father's words echoed again, from the days they stood together by the old kitchen counter. "People don't just pay to be fed, they pay to be respected. And when they leave here with a smile, that's when you've truly cooked for them." Dean laughed again, that same smug half-smile of a man who believed he had asserted his power. "Good job, Clara. We follow rules here, not feelings," he said mockingly, tapping the counter lightly as if to end the discussion. Clara said nothing, only stepped back, her eyes glistening with unspoken anger. Adrian remained in his corner, still playing the role of an ordinary dishwasher. But inside, every word, every gesture from Dean was like a needle driven deeper, fueling a fire he had been holding back since the moment he stepped in. He couldn't act now, not yet. But every sneer, every display of arrogance was feeding the slow burn, and Adrian knew the moment would come when that fire would erupt, consuming the false authority Dean Holloway believed was unshakable. He lowered his head, his hand gripping the frayed dishcloth so tightly it tore slightly. And at that very moment, Adrian Cole silently vowed to himself, Walter Briggs would be the last man to leave Porterhouse wearing that look of disappointment. The evening dragged on slowly, the air in the kitchen weighed down by the smell of burnt oil and the dull hum of the exhaust fan. Adrian remained at his dishwashing station, his hands moving like a machine, but his eyes never left the unfolding scene. He watched Clara Reed, who kept meticulously polishing glass after glass as if it were the only thing holding her together. Her movements were careful, every finger following the habits of someone once taught that every small detail was the honor of the restaurant. But that honor was being trampled hour after hour under Dean Holloway's hands. "Clara!" Dean's sharp bark cut through the kitchen, freezing the air. Clara flinched, set the glass down quickly, and rushed over. Dean stood with his arms crossed, his mouth twisted in a mocking grin. On the floor near the service counter, a puddle of water had spread beside a mop bucket. "You didn't put up the wet floor sign. A customer almost slipped here," Dean said, drawing out each word like a sentence being handed down. Clara looked around, confused. I'm sure I put it up earlier. I remember." "Don't argue," Dean interrupted, his voice cold. "Do you think I have time to make this up? Or do you want me to write you up so you get your shifts cut sooner?" Adrian tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. He had seen Dean earlier, walking past that very spot, folding the warning sign and tossing it aside as if it were nothing but trash. Dean wasn't just placing blame, he was creating it, setting a trap to humiliate Clara. Adrian had caught that satisfied smirk Dean wore when he glanced at Clara bending to mop, like a predator pleased with its own trap. Clara stayed silent, her lips pressed tight. She nodded, her voice small. "I'm sorry. I'll be more careful." Dean smirked, his half-smile making the air feel heavier. "Good. 3 more violations, and you know what happens." Adrian lowered his head, sliding a hand into his apron pocket and discreetly switching on the recorder on his phone, wrapped securely in a waterproof plastic bag. The steady clatter of dishes perfectly masked the faint beep of the device. His heart beat faster, not from fear of being caught, but from the anger boiling inside him. Minutes later, Dean proved once again he wasn't just a tyrant, but a thief. Adrian saw him walk to the register, pick up the cash left by a customer, and instead of handing it to the cashier to log in, he stuffed it directly into his pocket, smirking. "That customer got a free dessert, right? Consider it handled." The young cashier glanced nervously around before lowering her head, saying nothing. Adrian scrubbed a plate harder than necessary as if he could crush it in his hands. Every move Dean made was another blade carving deeper into the wound Porterhouse carried. But Adrian stayed silent because it wasn't time to act yet. Every word, every threat, every stolen dollar had to be recorded, carefully, piece by piece. Clara returned to the kitchen, her head down, scrubbing the floor like a machine. Adrian noticed her hands trembling, not from fear, but from anger. She bit her lip so hard it nearly drew blood, yet she said nothing. In the brief moment their eyes met, Adrian saw something familiar in hers, the same fire he once had as a young man, the same look he wore when a manager had belittled him for daring to demand better service for customers. He clenched the dish towel in his hands, his gaze darkening. He had let this place fall into the hands of people like Dean for too long, but the time of Dean's false reign was running out. Adrian glanced at Dean, who stood leaning smugly against the counter, that self-satisfied grin still on his face, and whispered silently to himself, "Keep smiling, because soon everything will crumble beneath you." The crackling from old oil pans echoed like tired sighs. Clara Reed stood at the front counter carrying a tray loaded with side dishes, carefully balancing each step as she crossed over a forgotten mop cord. The yellow light spilled across her face, revealing exhausted eyes still fighting to stay focused, as if letting her guard down for even a second would cause everything to collapse. Adrian watched silently from the dishwashing station, his hand resting on the edge of the sink, tightening slightly as if anticipating something bad. And it happened in just an instant. Clara's heel caught the loose cord, the tray tilted sharply, and a plate slid off, shattering against the floor with a harsh crack. Sauce splattered across her apron, leaving a dark gray-brown stain. Clara bent down quickly, gathering the shards, trying to hide the embarrassment on her face. But before she could straighten up, a voice cut through the room, dry and laced with disdain. "You again, Clara?" Dean Holloway stepped out from behind the counter, arms crossed, eyes locked on her like a man catching a thief in the act. He didn't glance at the broken plate or the misplaced mop cord. His gaze was fixed only on her bowed head. "I'm sorry," Clara murmured, her voice so soft it was nearly drowned out by the hum of the exhaust fan. Dean gave a short, cold laugh, his half-smile sharp as steel. "Sorry? Here, sorry means nothing. I've said it before, Porterhouse isn't a place for the clumsy." Then he looked around deliberately, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "See this? This is why customers lose faith. If a staff member can't even handle a tray of food, what more can we expect?" A few glances darted her way before quickly turning back. No one dared to intervene. Clara bit her lip hard, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the shards, silent as if the whole world had judged her guilty. Adrian stood motionless, as steady as a stone, but inside him a storm raged. He had seen enough, heard enough. And this time, the way Dean turned a small mistake into a public humiliation was the final straw. Adrian took a deep breath to keep from stepping forward, but his eyes betrayed the sharp, cutting glare he could no longer hide. Dean crouched slightly, pretending to help Clara pick up the pieces, but his words, spoken just loud enough for Adrian to hear, were nothing but a threat. "That's 3 mistakes, Clara. You know my rules. 1 more, and I'll hand Miles the write-up myself. Shift cuts. Maybe a whole week." He stood up, slapped her shoulder hard in a mock gesture of encouragement, and walked away with a smug grin. Clara stayed crouched, gathering the last shards, her back trembling slightly, but no tears fell. When she stood, Adrian noticed her apron soaked on one side, stained with sauce, shards of porcelain clinging to it. She didn't bother to brush them off, just lowered her head and quietly walked toward the cold storage to change. Adrian's eyes followed her. As Clara passed him, she glanced briefly at him, just for a second, but long enough for Adrian to see the exhaustion in her eyes. And then, as if she couldn't bear another moment, Clara slipped into the cold storage and shut the door behind her. Adrian set his dish towel down quickly, glanced around, and walked toward the storage room. He pushed the door open slightly but didn't step in. In the pale, bluish light, Clara stood against the meat rack, clutching a tissue tightly. She didn't sob, didn't make a sound, but her silent tears soaked the tissue, betraying her calm face. Her eyes, rimmed red, told the truth her expression tried to hide. Clara inhaled deeply, slowly wiping her face, then straightened herself like a machine, adjusting her fresh apron before stepping back out. As she opened the door and saw Adrian standing there, she hesitated. He didn't say anything, simply handed her a clean towel he had brought. Clara accepted it, her eyes lingering on him for a second, showing a flicker of gratitude before lowering her head and walking past him. Adrian stood there, watching her retreating figure, his chest tightening painfully. In that moment, one thing became crystal clear. This was no longer just about a decaying restaurant. This was about people like Clara being crushed every day under the rotten power that Dean Holloway embodied. And Adrian Cole swore he would not let it continue for one more day. The night faded slowly, the yellow kitchen lights casting a greasy sheen on the old frying pans, but they couldn't hide the weariness etched deep into every employee's face. Clara Reed kept moving like a machine, her hands swiftly arranging trays of food, her expression stiff, her eyes empty. Dean Holloway, on the other hand, leaned casually against the bar, holding a glass of soda, his lips curled into a smug smile as if this place were his private kingdom. Adrian stood in the corner by the sink, his hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater, but his chest burned hot, as if a fire was raging, demanding to break free. He watched Dean laugh and flirt with a new cashier, his hand resting far too long on her shoulder. Every gesture, every look of disdain, Adrian memorized, as if each one carved a deeper wound into his mind. And then when Dean turned and walked into the back office, Adrian knew the moment had come. He quietly removed his apron, drying his hands with slow, careful movement so as not to draw attention, then stepped back into the dark corner near the emergency exit. The kitchen doors swung open and closed. The staff called out orders, but no one paid attention to the dishwasher standing still in the shadows. Adrian pulled a worn phone from his jacket pocket, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from anger that had been restrained for too long. He dialed a familiar number and held the phone to his ear. The line rang only twice. "Yes?" Lance Monroe's deep, calm voice came through, as steady as always. "Lance, it's me," Adrian said quietly. His tone was even, but there was a weight in it that could not be missed. A brief pause followed before Lance spoke again. "You've found what you needed, haven't you?" Adrian drew in a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Dean through the office glass as the man laughed lazily with someone inside. "Shut this branch down. 3 days. I want a full cleanup." There was a second of silence on the other end. Then Lance replied firmly. "Understood. I'll handle it. Shut it down under the usual maintenance excuse?" "No," Adrian said, his voice dropping low like a quiet growl. "Tell Miles exactly why. Tell him I gave the order personally. This won't be a routine maintenance. I want a complete overhaul. New team, new procedures, and Lance..." He paused, his eyes narrowing on Dean. "Start drafting a training list. Only those who deserve to stay." "Got it," Lance answered. his tone sharper than usual. "When do we begin?" 3 days from now, Adrian replied, his gaze shifting to Clara, who was bent over wiping tables in the corner. "And I need to meet someone before this begins." "Clara Reed?" Lance asked, unable to hide his surprise. Adrian nodded slightly, even though Lance couldn't see it. "Yes, she's the only reason I believe this place is still worth saving. Arrange a private meeting. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. City Library, side entrance. Keep it discreet." "Understood. I'll send her the details without mentioning your name," Lance said quickly. Adrian ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and looked toward Dean, who sat in his office tapping his leg lazily, glancing at the staff outside like a puppeteer watching his marionettes. Adrian's hand tightened into a fist in his jacket pocket, his eyes glinting coldly. The storm had been scheduled, and it would begin with Clara Reed, the one person Adrian knew carried whatever soul was left in Porterhouse. He pulled his apron back on, returned to the sink, and resumed washing dishes as if nothing had happened, but his heartbeat pounded in his chest like war drums announcing the battle to come. The first morning after the closure notice, the sign in front of Cole's Porterhouse had been replaced with a plain white board bearing neat letters. "Internal training in progress, closed for 3 days." Passers-by glanced at it, some sighing, others snapping curious photos, but none of them knew that inside a quiet storm was beginning to unfold. There were no customers, no clattering dishes, only employees standing in line, exchanging uncertain glances. They had never experienced anything like this before. Clara Reed stood in the middle, holding a thick stack of documents. Her clean apron and neatly tied hair made her look entirely different from the weary figure she had been just days ago. She still trembled slightly, but her eyes held something new, something determined. Dean Holloway was nowhere to be seen. Officially, he had been temporarily reassigned, pending further evaluation. Clara swallowed hard, taking a deep breath. For the first time, she didn't have to shrink away from anyone, didn't have to bow her head in silence. Adrian stood at a distance, leaning against the wall near the kitchen door, arms crossed. He no longer wore his old dishwashing clothes, instead dressed in a simple dark shirt. He said nothing, didn't interfere, only observed with calm eyes that betrayed a glimmer of hope. Clara opened the documents, her voice slightly shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. "Starting today, everything changes. We will do things the right way, the way Porterhouse used to be proud of. We begin with strict kitchen quality control, rigorous hygiene standards, and a service attitude that respects every customer." She paused, scanning the room, her gaze meeting each pair of eyes. "If anyone cannot accept this, you may leave now." A heavy silence followed. Some employees lowered their heads, others exchanged glances, but no one moved. Clara nodded slightly, a small but firm smile appearing on her lips. The entire morning passed in an entirely different atmosphere. Clara moved through every station, inspecting each cutting board, each knife, demanding that they be sharpened and cleaned properly. She was no longer the tired, overworked server. She walked with confidence, pointing, instructing new staff with a calm but decisive tone. Adrian watched her from the corner of the room, his eyes following her every step. He thought of his father, a chef who never tolerated carelessness, who had once taught him, "Leadership doesn't require shouting. Do things right, and others will follow." And now, he was witnessing that very truth in Clara. There was a moment when Clara stopped at the bar counter, noticing a young staff member fumbling with the sanitation checklist. Instead of scolding, she knelt slightly, guiding him step by step, her voice gentle yet firm. "We'll redo this from the beginning. No one will blame you for not knowing, but from now on, we cannot repeat mistakes." The young man nodded, his face softening with relief, as if for the first time he felt respected in his own job. By noon, Adrian stepped away from the wall, walking down the short hallway to the back door. A rare smile touched his face, the first since he had returned here. The storm had begun, but it was not a loud, destructive one. It was like the first rain of the season, quiet yet strong enough to wash away everything old and broken. And the one holding the map for this storm was none other than Clara Reed. For the first time in years, Adrian felt true hope for Porterhouse. Through the glass, he could see Clara writing something on the new whiteboard, her expression serious, the staff sitting silently, their eyes no longer evasive but beginning to show sparks of focus. Adrian nodded slightly to himself, whispering under his breath, "Well done, Clara. This is only the beginning." On the afternoon of the third day, just as everything was beginning to fall into its new rhythm, the front door of Porterhouse burst open with a loud bang that froze the room in silence. Dean Holloway stormed in, his face flushed red, his eyes burning with anger. He wore a wrinkled maroon jacket, his hair disheveled, looking more like a cornered animal than the smug king he had once acted to be. The employees who were rearranging the kitchen counters froze, some lowering their heads to avoid his glare, others stealing quick glances toward Clara as if waiting for her to protect them. "What the hell is going on here?" Dean roared, striding toward the main counter, his shoes thudding hard against the floor. "Who authorized this closure? Who gave her," he pointed directly at Clara, "the right to run this place?" Clara didn't move. Her eyes were calmer than ever, though her hands tightened slightly around the stack of documents she held. She wasn't fearless, but she knew Adrian was here, and she trusted him. Dean took another step, his voice dropping lower, sharp as a blade. "Answer me, Clara. Who do you think you are? Some lowly waitress who dares—" He didn't finish his sentence. A deep voice cut through the air, clear and commanding, like a blade slicing through the tension. "That's enough, Dean." The room fell into complete silence. Dean turned, and for the first time in years he hesitated. Adrian Cole stood in the middle of the room, no longer in his faded gray dishwashing clothes, but in a crisp black shirt with his sleeves rolled up. His gaze was steady, calm, yet carried a weight that no one dared look away from. Dean let out a short, nervous laugh, trying to maintain composure, but his voice betrayed him. "Who the hell are you? Stay out of this. I run this restaurant, not you." Adrian walked forward slowly, each step echoing clearly in the stillness. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped, pulled out a thick folder from under his arm, and dropped it on the counter with a sharp thud. "You run this restaurant?" Adrian's voice was even, but every word carried authority. "Then explain this, Dean Holloway. Tips stolen. Wet floor warning signs deliberately removed. Expired meat served to customers. And this." He placed a small USB drive on the counter. "Recorded threats against staff. All of it. You." Dean's face drained of color, his eyes locked on the USB as if it were a noose tightening around his neck. You think you can just—" "Adrian Cole," Adrian interrupted, his voice dropping lower, his eyes cold as steel. "Owner of Porterhouse. And as of today, I'm taking back what's mine." For a moment, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. The employees exchanged glances, some gasping quietly, others staring at Dean with new, unreadable expressions. Dean stepped back, his face red with anger, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. I've been running this place for 3 years." Adrian took one step closer, his tone cutting like a blade. "You've been killing it for 3 years, Dean, and now it's over." He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His words carried the kind of power that couldn't be challenged. "The paperwork was signed this morning. You'll be paid for your last 2 weeks, but as of this moment, you have no authority here." Dean stood frozen, his lips trembling as if to argue, but when he looked into Adrian's eyes that left no room for negotiation, he knew he had lost. There was no coming back from this. He turned sharply, storming out, his footsteps pounding against the floor like the death toll of his false reign. No one followed him. No one looked at him with pity. When the door closed, the silence felt almost strange. Clara straightened, meeting Adrian's gaze, and for the first time in days, her lips curved into a smile of gratitude, but also of hope. Adrian gave a small nod, saying nothing, but exhaled quietly, as if lifting a heavy weight off his chest. Porterhouse was finally free from the grip of a tyrant, and from this very moment, a new chapter would begin. 3 days after Dean Holloway's departure, Porterhouse looked like an entirely different place. The once dusty windows now gleamed crystal clear, The meat display counter showcased rows of vibrant red ribeye steaks with perfectly even white marbling, neatly arranged on polished stainless steel trays. The acrid smell of burnt oil that used to cling to the walls was gone, replaced by the warm aroma of melting butter mingling with the faint, smoky scent of grilled steak, the very essence Porterhouse had once prided itself on. Clara Reed stood in the center of the room, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning every corner of the kitchen. She was no longer the girl who once bowed her head under pressure. Every movement now carried confidence, her voice clear and steady. Table 4. Check the tablecloth before seating the guests. Steak knives must be sharpened every morning, and remember, any dish that doesn't meet standards goes straight back to the kitchen. Her words didn't sound like harsh orders, but rather sincere reminders, and the staff nodded in agreement rather than complying out of fear. Mira, who had once been indifferent, now carefully wiped down the spice counter, glancing toward Clara every so often to make sure she hadn't missed anything. A young staff member, only in his second week, even approached Clara, asking how to plate a dish more beautifully. Clara nodded, smiling encouragingly. Good. Just a little care, and the customers will feel the difference. Adrian stood quietly in the corner, hands in his pockets, watching everything unfold. He didn't interfere, didn't give orders, just observed, his eyes reflecting quiet satisfaction. He watched as Clara moved from the kitchen counter to the bar, adjusting the posture of a staff member who was standing incorrectly, giving his shoulder a light pat when he nodded in thanks. Those gestures weren't loud or commanding, but they carried a certain strength, the kind of strength Adrian knew his father had once possessed. By the afternoon, Porterhouse opened its doors to its first guests after the training period. A quiet sense of anticipation spread through the room like an invisible thread. Clara stepped to the front counter, straightening her collar, her eyes fixed on the wooden door as it swung open. A young couple walked in, looking around with surprise. They whispered to each other about how different the atmosphere felt, now cleaner, brighter, and somehow just right. Clara approached them, smiling warmly. "Welcome to Porterhouse. We are honored to serve you today." Her smile was no longer forced, but genuine, born from a newfound belief that this place had truly changed. From across the room, Adrian nodded slightly, a rare smile tugging at his lips. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against the old wooden sign on the wall, where the words, "Since 1987, still bore a small scratch his father had left years ago. In that moment, it felt as if he were speaking directly to him. "Father, Porterhouse is back, and this time, I won't let it lose its soul again." As the young couple exchanged satisfied smiles after their first bite of steak, Adrian quietly stepped back, leaving the main dining room. He knew that from this moment on, Porterhouse was no longer just his restaurant. It was becoming a true home for those who believed in honest, heartfelt values, starting with Clara Reed and the employees who had chosen to stay. That evening, the warm yellow lights of Porterhouse glowed softly, reflecting off the freshly polished tables and chairs, giving the place the welcoming feel of a true home. There was no longer the chaotic noise from before, only the gentle rhythm of knives and forks clinking against plates, mixed with the quiet laughter of guests enjoying their meals. Clara Reed stood near the counter, her eyes moving from table to table, watching every staff member carefully, her gaze filled with pride, though a faint trace of tension still lingered. At the corner table sat an elderly man with neatly combed silver hair. Walter Briggs, the same man who had left disappointed just days ago. This time, in front of him lay a perfectly grilled porterhouse steak, its pink center glowing evenly, the edges glistening with melted fat like honey. Clara stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on the back of his chair, her voice soft. "I hope this time the meal will make you happy." Walter looked up, his eyes glimmering as he sliced into the steak, tasting it slowly before nodding, a small smile tugging at his lips, enough to make Clara exhale in relief. "Thank you, young lady," he said, his voice deep and warm. "This is better than anything I've had in years." Clara smiled back, her expression no longer hesitant but filled with quiet pride. "Thank you for coming back. It's an honor to serve you." The scene caught Adrian Cole's attention. He stood near the entrance, leaning against the dark wooden wall, not moving closer, just watching in silence as something warm and peaceful stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his father's passing. His eyes followed Clara, noting her straight posture, the sharp yet kind look in her eyes, the way she calmly scribbled customer feedback into her notebook. In that moment, Adrian understood. Porterhouse no longer needed an owner to stand over it, giving orders. What it needed were people like her people who believed that kindness was what kept this place alive. Adrian stepped forward, holding the old brass-colored keys of the restaurant in his hand. Clara turned, surprised to see him standing in front of her. Adrian didn't speak much. He simply looked straight into her eyes, his voice deep, steady, and certain. Keep this place as it was always meant to be. Don't let it lose itself again. Clara froze for a brief second, her eyes widening, as if she couldn't quite believe she was hearing those words from Adrian Cole himself. She accepted the keys with both hands, gripping them tightly, not as if they were a possession, but as a promise. I will, she said, her voice slightly trembling, but her gaze unwavering. Adrian nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips, rare but filled with trust. He turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the night sky stretched in a deep navy blue, a light breeze making the wooden "Since 1987" sign sway gently. The golden light from inside reflected Adrian's shadow on the damp pavement. He paused, looking down at his reflection, then back through the glass door where Clara stood. She didn't follow him, didn't say a word, only stood there holding the keys firmly, her face calm, but her eyes shining with determination. Adrian smiled softly, lowering his head in a quiet farewell that needed no words, then turned and walked away. He no longer needed to be here every day because Porterhouse had found its heart again. And that heart now rested in Clara Reed's hands. Inside, Clara turned, her eyes sweeping over the restaurant once more. The staff moved diligently, customers smiled, and the sound of knives and forks blended into a gentle symphony. She took a deep breath, then walked to the large whiteboard near the counter, picked up a marker, and wrote in bold letters, "We don't just cook. We give respect." That night, when Porterhouse closed, Clara was the last to leave. She stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at her reflection in the glass, then reached for the switch, turning off the lights row by row. The glow inside faded until only the small wooden sign outside remained, shining softly under the streetlights. Porterhouse since 1987. But this time it was no longer an old, forgotten symbol. It was a promise, the beginning of something new. An expert in the culinary industry once said, "The true strength of a restaurant does not lie in its recipes, but in how it treats people from the customers to the staff working behind the kitchen counter." Adrian Cole proved exactly that. Change begins with respect, and respect is what keeps the soul of any brand alive. If you believe that kindness is the most important ingredient in every success, hit like and subscribe to help spread inspiring stories like this. And don't forget to leave a comment with the 3 words "believe in people," because it was that very belief that brought Porterhouse back to life.